going to end, and I see that, Rashid, you have a question. Sorry if I didn't see it earlier because I'm looking at my slides, so I don't see faces, but go ahead.
Yes, thank you. That is an excellent, I suppose, but sad travel through the Bosnian situation. I must apologize that I had to leave for a few minutes because I received a very important international call, so I missed part of it, but I'll probably catch it up later on. Now, my question is as follows. Having heard your relationship with and your speaking to people who are Salafists, among others, do you feel that Salafism of all the parts of Islam, or all the ideas of Islamicity, is the most dangerous of the ones which can marginalize and radicalize? And I'm asking this because I have friends who are Salafis, and I'm trying very hard to bring them back to the middle of the road.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree with you that it is really Salafism that is problematic because of its lack of tolerance towards diversity within perspectives within Islam. And I would say that certainly not all Salafis are, and you know that, and I know that, all Salafis are not terrorists, but most of those who claim that violence is acceptable in the name of Islam, who have radicalized, have had some connection to Salafism. And so clearly that lack of tolerance tends to be, and this is the case whether we look at Christianity or any other religion, when one locks themselves into an ultra-conservative, purist perspective that does not allow space for other opinions and views, and becomes extremely traditionalist in how they see and interpret Islam, that becomes problematic. And that's why, by the way, I'm just gonna go back to that slide, Rashid. I would recommend for you and others to read, because this particular article is actually open access. So it's a scholarly article that the journal has made accessible openly. Epistemological shifts in knowledge and education in Islam, where I basically go through entire history of Islam and look at how early on during the golden age of Islam, that in fact many Salafis who radicalize say we want to go back to those times. When you actually dig deeper and you acquire knowledge on that period of Islam, you realize that in fact at that time, Islam emerged and spread so quickly because it was accepting of diversity and because it perpetuated this idea that critical thinking is encouraged, that critical thinking is important, that scientific discovery is basically in sync with belief in Islam, that one or the other didn't have to be excluded. And so I essentially go through that transformation of how did we get here? How did we go from having House of Wisdom, where in Iraq, so much knowledge, algebra, astronomy, poetry was produced, to now having radicalized groups within Islam that have given us this negative image worldwide that somehow Muslims are against science, against prosperity, against modernity, which was not the case during the golden age of Islam. And so I think this is a very useful, I won't go into all the details, but this is a very useful, powerful read that really unveils why did these changes happen and what problems we need to address today within the Muslim community to change the thinking about what Islam is all about.
May I ask a follow-up question, because I might not have heard answer before. It may have been asked, and that is, where are the ISIS people originally Salafists in their belief?
So here's what I would say: when you actually look at the data on many, and I know this from conversing with some of these radicalized individuals in Bosnia, they often won't say that they're Salafis, right? They're not going to say we have Salafi beliefs or not. They are only going to say that they're the only true Muslims and nobody else is Muslim but them. Number one. Number two, they tend to know very little actually about Islam. They tend to have this skewed information and often are lack knowledge on Islam in a way that is almost shocking. And in fact, even if you look back to Osama bin Laden's story as the ultimate example of a terrorist in the name of Islam, he started on his path without really knowing much about Islam. It seemed that he always tried to acquire knowledge from others. So yes, there is some basis in these Salafi ideas that are, I would say, ultra-conservative ideas that are finding their way in groups like ISIS or Boko Haram also. But those are ideas that don't represent, in my view, what Islam is all about. So I wouldn't call them knowledge. I would call them their own interpretation that is inaccurate about what Muslims should be like and who Muslims are. And I think Islam becomes just this ideological engine because they don't have another way to unify themselves in their grievances, whether their grievances are political, economic, and so Islam has gotten negative press because of the people who know actually very little about Islam. Thank you, Rashid, for that question. I see, thank you. I see Irfan.
Once again, Assalamu alaikum, Sister Amra. Before raising a question, I just want to say a few words about the lecture. What I see that, it's very easy to say the word forgiving and to forgive what you have done. I see through the Quranic ayat that Allah teaches us, repel evil with good. I can see practically you followed that. And really, I can see the example of a person following. I really thank you for that. And also I understand that, bombing happening in, let's say in Iraq through ISIS, and if through that bombing, a Christian woman, the story came up into one of the news channels, that Christian woman lost her leg. And then how we can convince her that Prophet is sent as a mercy when Muslims themselves are involved into bombing and she lose the leg because of the ISIS activity. So meaning, what I mean here to say is that, yes, what you said is right, and I totally agree that only education and correct information will help and educate Muslims to repel this, they get radicalized due to emotions by few people who takes advantage of religion and achieve their political motive. But now coming to one question, like how do you think that KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, also played role into Serb repelling Muslim, because they were thinking to get a separate land or separate Kosovo. So maybe that was also a reason for the Serb to attack Muslim. Is it one of the reasons as well, according to you?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So your question is basically just to make sure that I understand it. Why Kosovo was Kosovo's independence or Bosnia's independence or Croatia's independence the reason that triggered the war?
Yeah, meaning that was also one of the reasons why Yugoslavia or Serbia were attacking Muslim. Maybe one of the reasons to add into Islamophobia.
Absolutely. But here's the challenge. So Yugoslavia Bosnia existed for 1,000 years as a country. It was a kingdom, obviously it took different forms over the course of history. It was dominated by different colonial powers. Ottoman Empire came, brought in Islam. People were encouraged, particularly landowners and the wealthy intelligentsia, to convert so that they could pay less taxes. That's how Islam came about in the region and existed for hundreds of years. Austrian-Hungarian Empire dominated over Bosnia, but always Bosnia existed as a country. Croatia had existed historically as a country, and Yugoslavia became this kind of unified federation that resulted as or was produced at the end of the World War II, or happened during the World War II. There was, prior to that, in fact, for a few decades, there was existence of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenians, which basically entirely excluded acknowledgement of Bosnia as a country itself, even though it did encompass Bosnia too. The challenge was that in Yugoslavia, Serbia got to a point of power where the only way they would want to have Yugoslavia together is if they dominated everybody else. And so, in other words, they wanted to take all the power. So assume equivalent comparison in the United States today. Let's assume New York State decides white people live in New York State and we want to dominate the entire United States of America, and we will take power from everybody else who is not like us. And so that is really the narrative that happened within Serbia. And there were so many attempts, in fact, by Bosnia and Croatia and Slovenia and Kosovo to try to come to an agreement with Serbia of some kind of equivalent sharing of power to avoid war, because these other republics didn't want to be part of a war in which they knew that they were likely to lose simply because Serbia controlled the army. 98% of the officers in Yugoslav National Army were Serbs. So if you were Muslim, it didn't matter what credentials you had, you could never be in a position of power in the military. And it only became clear why when the genocide happened, because the whole army basically became Serbia's army. No, there was nobody protecting anybody else. And so there were many attempts made prior to the war. And just to address Kosovo specifically, Kosovo was an autonomous region. Vast majority of people were Albanians. Most Albanians are Muslims, not all. And so this was another region in former Yugoslavia where Muslims were concentrated. I can tell you that growing up in former Yugoslavia, there was a constant feeding of narrative that Kosovo Muslims are dangerous, that they are raping Serb women, that they can't have their language, that they can't have any rights. And there was this narrative of exclusion and really persecution of Muslims in Kosovo that was continuous during my lifetime. And when Serbia essentially turned Yugoslavia, what was left of it, right? Because Slovenia left, Croatia left, Bosnia left, and all of those proclamations of independence triggered wars and genocide. Kosovo didn't want to stay in what was called Yugoslavia, but was de facto just Serb-controlled regions, because these people never had any rights, even though they were always an independent region within that Yugoslavia. And so, separating Kosovo as an independent country, or Bosnia saying we want our independence from Serbia's domination, was certainly a trigger for Milosevic, but there was no possibility or room in which we could exist in Yugoslavia unless we lost our identity. We're not allowed to rise, have social mobility in the society. There was simply no opportunities for people who were non-Serbs. And so no one wants to live that life. And so, of course, I wish the war didn't happen, but I don't think that the victims of genocide are the ones who were at fault. We didn't start the war. We didn't have military. We had no power. We just wanted equal rights, which we were never given in former Yugoslavia. So I see, Rashid, let me just get, Majid had his hand up and then I'll come to you. So Majid, go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Jazakillah for your wonderful presentation. It was very much informative and thought-provoking. May God bless you. There is a general perception amongst a very large section of the Muslims worldwide that all one hears or reads about the ISIS, Daesh or Al-Qaeda, it is nothing but Goebbelian propaganda by the intel agencies of the US, Israel, along with the media to malign Islam and subjugate the Muslims. It is a notion that it could be even partly true, but since there is no attempt visible to counter this belief, the perception has gained credence. I want to ask you 2-3 things. Radical Islamist ideology. It has existed since a millennium, but has flared up only in area affected by the Western powers. How to counter its effect on an ideological plane? Number 2, ma'am, do you think that the current world crisis are the result of the clash of civilizations or clash of religions or a general lack of God consciousness? And thirdly, I believe the Muslim intelligentsia should refer the original wordings of the scripture and should engage to correct and purge the Islamic literature of malicious and evil content that has infiltrated its noble ideology and way of life. What will be your response? Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you for those questions. And to me, they're connected. And I have to say that certainly conspiracy theories, we see them in the United States with QAnon. Conspiracy theories were part of reasons why the entire genocide against Bosnian Muslims happened. We know that people like Stephen Miller, who was the underling of Donald Trump, former president of the United States, depicted Islam as fascism. And so there has been a propaganda really to depict Islam as this ideology that is solely tied to violence. And I think that the only effective way, and you'll see that in this article, I still have the slide up, you will see that really for me, the only effective way for us is to, as Muslims, have a form of awakening, whether it's moral awakening, whether it's educational awakening, you can label it however you like. But what I see necessary is for us within our own communities and other communities in both kind of playing fields to counter these narratives, to counter whatever conspiracy theories are conflicting with what we believe is one, truth about the status of Muslims in different parts of the world. And two, I think it's important to in that countering of radicalization within and conspiracy theories within our own communities, it's important to acknowledge these grievances. I think the fact that the Western world, for instance, didn't react when the genocide happened in Bosnia, or the fact that Western world has often engaged in various military activities in the Middle East, all those issues are not often discussed, certainly not in educational system, not addressed. And that really leaves the space for these conspiracy theories that you are talking about. I also think that in many developing contexts, in many predominantly Muslim countries, we really have not focused on education. We have not focused on telling stories like The Cat I Never Named to inspire young generations to be resilient. I think there is a distinction between countering a narrative and building resilience to narrative. In other words, I can say, don't radicalize young people, not a good idea, violence is never an answer. But that may not be effective. What's more effective is building resilience in young people who will be exposed, especially in the context of social media. They'll be exposed to all kinds of conspiracy theories, but be able to say, I'm resilient to that, and I am not going to be susceptible to the process of radicalization is important. And that can only happen if we improve educational systems and educational opportunities for people around the world. In many contexts, we don't have, as an example, for instance, Pakistan or Nigeria, places where we've seen radicalization often happens because people don't have opportunities, either economic opportunities or educational opportunities. They're only exposed to these conspiracy theories. They're not studying physics, mathematics. They're memorizing Quran and getting some kind of interpretation that is really not consistent with what I was talking about, why Islam even came about as a very progressive movement, very much open to critical inquiry and science and progress. And that's why we had Islamic empire that very quickly expanded, because it brought progressive ideas with it. We don't have that in many parts of the Muslim world. And I do think that it is on us as much as it is in many ways, responsibility of developed parts of the world to really provide those opportunities. And the only effective way to counter these conspiracy theories wherever they emerge. Habib, go ahead. Habib?
Oh, okay. Okay. I've never seen the cover of a book so depictive and so beautifully explained, that depiction so beautifully explained. I've just bought the book after hearing about what you talk, after hearing you speak, and I must say that I thoroughly enjoyed the thing. It was so crystal clear as to what we need to be doing. My question to you, and you kept answering my questions as someone else asked them and things like that, so I don't even really know if I have a question to ask. But I'd say this, was Bosnia and Kosovo at that time, was orthodoxy on both sides also a reason, first? And second, how are Muslims in Kosovo and Bosnia today with regard to other faiths and other communities? And the third thing is, don't you think that integration and being a part of societies and not being within our own communities is one of the reasons why this has grown in the United States too?
Excellent questions. Thank you, Habib, for buying the book. And I'll just, for those of you who don't have it yet, I just want to share one detail. You can actually see intentionally chosen a mosque in the background on the cover from a village of Ahmići, which is a village in Bosnia where there was a photograph of this mosque being destroyed. But it really symbolizes that the genocide was about destruction and eradication of Bosnian Muslims in every possible sense, including the cultural genocide. And so we had many mosques, and not as many are left after the war, because 80% of the mosques during the war were either destroyed or damaged in some way. And so it was important to me to reflect that identity. But I did that in sync of presenting myself as a moderate Muslim. So it didn't really matter whether I was religious or not, and to what extent for those who were pursuing genocide and eradication of Muslims. It didn't really matter who the victims were, and whether we were religious or not, we were hated by them, and the genocide was the result of their perception of who we were, irrespective of our own humanity and our own diversity as Bosnian Muslims, or Muslims in Kosovo for that matter. And your question of really Bosnian Muslims and Muslims in Kosovo and where we are today, really the story in Kosovo and Bosnia are very similar in a sense that the goal was eradication of Islam. But I'll give you an example in the current structure of Bosnia that resulted from the Dayton Peace Accord that was signed in November of 1995. Dayton Peace Accord was really sponsored by the international community. Richard Holbrooke, who studied at Brown University, where I got my first degree in the US in economics, was a creator of that agreement that actually legitimized genocide. I have to say here that the United States didn't know when the agreement was signed that Serbs committed genocide. That was only established in 2007 and through various international. Yes, Faiz.
And then
yes, I can.
You can hear me now.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah. Okay. Great. No, nothing. Because there was some technical problem. I could connect.
Awesome.
So I think you should be able to see me now. Great.
We can see you and hear.
Great. Go ahead. Please go ahead. I'm sorry. I don't.
No problem.
Great.
No problem. Glad that you're here. So I just wanted to say that the structure that ensued as a result of genocide was actually division. Call it racial or ethnic, religious division in Bosnia was legitimized because Serbs were given half of the country that they ethnically cleansed. And today it's called Serb Republic, and exactly what they named it during the war. And that Serb Republic exists as a separate entity within Bosnian state. The problem is that at the time when the Dayton Peace Accord allowed for that to happen, the international community didn't have the evidence yet, because the court proceedings only followed after the war, that actually that Serb Republic was based on pure ethnic cleansing and genocide. So today we have a dysfunctional state in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where half of the country is where Muslims and Catholics and other groups live, and half the country is where primarily Serbs live, and their leadership continues to undermine functionality of Bosnia. And so I am one of the proponents of reforming that structure in Bosnia, because we might be one of the very few countries in the world that exists in 21st century where de facto racial segregation has been legalized. And my hope is that the Biden administration will take a very close look at that legacy of genocide that continues to exist by having this segregation and separation in Bosnia. To give you an example, we have schools in Bosnia where Muslim children and non-Muslim children enter have two different entrances. They have different teachers. They learn different curriculum, and where children who are non-Serbs will never learn the genocide happened. And that, of course, will have repercussions down the road and potentially incite another form of violence that will come. I think for the country to come together, we need to go through a collective admission of guilt for those who partook in genocide and move forward with reconciliation. It's always hard to do. In Germany, it was hard to do, but I think it's a necessary step to make a difference. And so that really answers your, I think, third question or sub-question of integration is very important, but integration has to be based on an honest conversation about exclusion, marginalization, Islamophobia, or potential violence or legacy of genocide, as is the case in Bosnia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Habib. And I welcome anybody else who has questions. Please feel free to.
Yeah. Anyone else with a question can ask? Yes, can unmute and ask. Well, I can't see any hands being raised at the moment. Okay. Okay, looks like there are no more questions, Amra.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. Well, I was.
Hello. I think we can't hear you actually.
You can hear me?
I think your voice. Yeah, no, I think you're breaking. Your voice is breaking.
I'm not. It must be internet.
We can't hear you. Yeah, there's some.
I can
even for me, it didn't happen. I mean, there's some.
I can hear. I just have a follow-up question.
Go ahead, Habib. Can you hear me?
Have you
Okay.
have you ever had the opportunity to address a gathering of ulemas, religious people from the pulpit, which is where this thing from our side also has to come?
No, I have not. I have never been invited. I've been invited around the world to address various groups. I've spoken over the last 6 months since the book has become very prominent and critically acclaimed in the United States. I've been invited by various groups in Italy, in Sweden, in Belgium, in Norway, in Germany, in Austria, Indonesia, Jordan, Turkey. I mean, the list goes on. But I have never been asked to speak in front of a religious community or religious leaders. I would love to have that opportunity, to be very honest, because I think it's important to have these conversations within those who are leaders in our communities.
Enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, and the talk. Thank you very much, Amra.
Thank you, Habib.
In fact, Amra, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. I think I wanted to ask you a question in the sense that, there's a tendency today in India by some Muslims to blame the Muslims themselves for their victimhood. In fact, they say that, some people keep writing in the press here, even in India, saying that Muslims feign victimhood. They're not really victims. So it is they who are to be blamed, not the other side. So this tendency to put the entire blame, partial blame also, in my opinion, cannot be put on the community, because the community itself is a double victim. On the one side, you have the right wingers attacking them, killing them, lynching them. On the other side, they are victims of their own clergy who issue fatwas, who try to control them, keep them under the thumb. So the Muslim community as such is actually caught between two extremes. So, but there is a tendency within Muslim societies to shift the entire blame on the community itself. If they blame the ulama, if they blame the clergy for trying to control the community, I can understand. But these people, they're Muslims basically, in powerful positions. The privileged Muslims in powerful positions, sitting from their coign of vantage. They would like to tell the Muslim that it is you who have to blame, not the other side. Have you ever faced such things, even in Bosnia or in anywhere else? Maybe you have traveled widely. In any of the Muslim societies, have you observed where some Muslim, within the Muslim community, Muslim themselves blaming their own community entirely for the problem? Have you come across any such incident, any such case anywhere else?
You know what I think one of the facts that relates to your question is also this struggle that, as you said, sort of double marginalization that might happen. On one hand, we have marginalization that Muslims experience in the Western context, right? We do have research that shows Muslim kids are bullied, Muslim kids may be called stupid or terrorists. And so there are all these negative perceptions that Muslims, when they are a minority in a community, may be dealing with. At the same time, even in predominantly Muslim environments, for instance, in Bosnia still today, the average Muslim is a victim of corruption in the society and dysfunctional society that really adversely impacts opportunities for Muslims. So I do think that what you are suggesting sometimes is a claim that stems from this awareness that in many Muslim societies, there are larger societal issues, particularly of corruption by those in leadership positions, or societies that have dictatorships where the voices and the grievances of those who are marginalized are not heard. And so I can certainly see in Bosnia often people will reach out to me and say, well, the real problem is our own leaders who are corrupt, who are not solving economic, political, and social issues, who are only self-centered or their own prosperity. We've seen that criticism in the context of Saudi Arabia and opulent lifestyle while promoting certain conservative religious view around the world. And so I think that dynamic also needs to be discussed within Muslim communities. And I think where there is a blame to be placed on the local leaders, it should be placed, but not necessarily in terms of whether we're blaming Muslims or not Muslims. I think who is precluding development and inclusion of the community, irrespective of what their religious background is. So in Bosnia, yes, the West has neglected us, but also community has been neglected by the local leaders. And I would just also add that we do know that the vast majority of victims of terrorism in the world are actually Muslims. So in many cases, when the extremist organizations that say, in the name of Islam, we're going to engage in violence, in fact, often the targeted groups are innocent Muslims who are victims of that terrorism. So I would say that the position of Muslims in many communities is very, very complicated because of these various dynamics that adversely impact an average member of a community.
So what you mean basically is that you cannot blame the community itself, right? For instance, you can't blame the Saudi Arabians for what the rulers are doing. You know, you can't say it's because of you.
Absolutely no. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
but there is but in India right now there is a tendency here of the privileged class of Muslims. They're not outsiders. You see, even non-Muslim blames the Muslim community as a whole, I can accept. But the Muslim themselves have started blaming them, you know. That's another painful thing for us. It's happening, but
I also think, Faiz, that often happens when Muslims being a targeted community in India, right? Being marginalized community as a collective, given the political dynamics in India at the moment. I also think that those Muslims perhaps who gain leadership positions are concerned that the only way they can stay and maintain their elite status is perhaps by, in some way, rejecting their own community of Muslims. And perhaps that could be, I'm not an expert on India, but that could be a dynamic that's impacting the rationale why they're putting the blame on the community rather than trying to figure out how they can represent the community and address community grievances so that radicalization on both sides could be lessened. Because we've seen that with other marginalized groups. There are many Muslims who survived genocide who today live in the United States or elsewhere that I know who are intellectuals who don't want to engage in any conversations because they want to build a sense of belonging in the societies where they are. And they're afraid if they engage in a conversation about Islam, given its negative portrayal around the world, that somehow their own personal benefits will be adversely impacted. So that may be calculation that the leaders within the Muslim community in India are making out of concern for their own status and social place in social hierarchy.
Yeah. See, what I basically feel is, you know, we need to build a counter narrative against the Salafism, like the ideologies such as Salafism, which radicalize people, which present an interpretation of Islam which is highly problematic and extremist in its approach. We have to take on these thought leaders who are trying to do that instead of attacking the community itself, which is a double victim, right? So on the one hand, we legally and we intellectually counter any kind of right-wing attack. At the same time, we also counter the Muslim right wing. We also counter them intellectually. I mean, present a counter narrative against extremist thought, especially the Salafi thought that is widely prevalent today through internet. So I think that we need to do. I agree with you there in the sense that the community itself should not be, berated or demeaned or even accused of being feigning victimhood as is being done today. Anyway, I don't see any other hand raised. If anybody else wants to ask another question, perhaps they can ask. They can unmute and ask.
Yeah, can I ask?
Yeah. Please go ahead. Please go ahead. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask one more question on that. How much do you think self-introspection Muslim society as a whole should look into on the part of Islamophobia?
Could you just increase your volume? I can barely hear you. I don't know if it's the case with everybody else. If you could increase your volume maybe on your computer or come closer to your device.
Now you can hear me? Now it's clear?
Let's try.
Hello?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I just wanted to ask about how much do you think like Muslim as a community should do introspect themselves on the basis of like what is actually narration going around. For example, back in India, we are facing the similar situation politically or in a part of like a religiously. Maybe it might be a backlash what going around all over the world, how this other communities see that Muslim are radicalizing. Maybe they will also have Daesh type of thing in India, so they want to prevent, or maybe they might have something in their mind, but and so they are maybe lynching and other things are going around. But how do you see that in this situation, as you said, that only knowledge can work out, plus knowledge, information, and self-introspection is also needed, or it should be like only we should focus on education and we say like the way you have addressed the issue, how to put forward. I'm just trying to figure it out. Meaning, I will again repeat it. Like in India, particularly, I'm talking from the Indian point of view. That in India, we are having this kind of extreme lynching, and due to Islamophobia, this kind of attacks are happening in India, and Muslim people are radicalizing. Like how you showed the way that we should not radicalize. That is the one way of approaching, but also there is another way of self-introspection by Muslims themselves to see that why this happened or why they are having this kind of behavior towards Muslims. So self-introspection, according to you, how does it play the role in this scenario?
You bring interesting points, and I would say what you're talking about is really, in the broadest sense, the question of education. We can't address neither radicalization nor Islamophobia without multiple efforts that happen really simultaneously. One of those efforts is one's own self-reflection. Who am I? Who I want to be? Am I willing to engage in one kind of activity or another kind of activity, and how should I respond to attempts for marginalization and exclusion and why is it happening to me? So is there anything that I can do to preclude that from happening? And one of my answers there is that I in The Cat I Never Named, in my book, I don't preach, I don't tell people what to do, but through my own experiences, I give people example of how one can respond, and how engaging in violence or radicalization is never an option. So as an example, even in the midst of genocide, when I was being targeted and my family members were being killed, I share examples and stories of really tell the story of how I tried to teach myself mathematics and physics on my own. And I taught myself English. I was not formally educated in English. I took an old dictionary of my father's and memorized all of the English words. I couldn't pronounce them, but I could write them, spell them, and know what they meant. And so I demonstrate this extreme example of how even when I'm subjected to genocide, I refuse to respond with violence. And it's incredibly empowering. And I don't think that we have many of these stories. We have, as I said, problem of in poor parts of the world and within poor Muslim communities, we have entry by groups that are trying to radicalize by offering really subpar education or no education at all, and offering this narrative of violence. And so I think it is responsibility of those of us who are intellectual leaders, whether in India or in other communities, to take that responsibility to help counter that narrative within our own communities and be able to say, when a terrorist attack happens and it is committed by someone who says, I did it in the name of Islam, that we speak out and say, this is unacceptable. This does not represent what Islam is all about. But we also have to be the leaders who will call out the Western world, or will call out leaders in our own countries and say, what you are doing, Mr. President, as was the case during the Trump administration, instituting the Muslim ban or calling Islam dangerous or unacceptable or inconsistent with Western values, is not acceptable, and it is marginalizing and only helping to radicalize Muslims further. So I do think that there are layers to the educational process. One is that self-reflection and self-education. One is educating those within our Muslim communities, as I think Rashid, who is no longer on the call because there were challenges with his muting and unmuting, who said we need to do something within our own communities, but also we need to then think about how are we being positioned within our nations and on a larger scale, and what we need to do to be voices of reason. I don't think that we have sufficiently done that as a Muslim community. Part of the problem is also that, for instance, when one thinks about Western media, they tend to be attracted only to the stories of Islam being equated to violence, because that delivers more interest and more views. They're not interested as much in stories of Muslims propagating social cohesion and inclusion and peaceful approach to solving various issues. And so we have challenges on many levels, but I do think that more people need to speak out. And that's something that I'm doing, but I can't do it alone. I need other leaders in other contexts to engage in the same kinds of conversations and be honest about who we are, what we need to change within our communities, but also within our nations that often perpetuate Islamophobia, and that's not helping our communities, nor is it helping social cohesion at the national level.
Yeah, I think you have put it very beautifully. Yeah, anybody else who's hello? Okay. No, I think you have put it beautifully, Amra, because the problem that I mentioned to you was a one-sided thing. You're speaking about both sides. Yes, while we need to ask Muslims to introspect, you don't go and tell a Bosnian community who has been just attack genocidally, genocidally, tell them that your fate, this happened to you only because you didn't practice Islam properly, only because you didn't fast, you didn't pray, you didn't read the Quran, you didn't understand the Quran. If you go and tell the Bosnians when they were being killed, how would it feel? That's what I'm trying to tell you. That is not fair. So, and these people who tell Muslims, like you said, one interesting sentence that you used, phrase that you used was, I don't preach. But the problem here has been people keep preaching. They keep, without talking about, or without calling out Islamophobic attacks against the Muslims. So what we need to do, in my opinion, is we need to present both sides, talk about both sides. While we ask the Muslims to introspect, not to fall prey to extremist ideologies, to resist Salafism, extremist Salafism, or any kind of extremist ideology, at the same time, we also call out people when they attack Islam, attack Muslims unfairly. Unfair attacks on Islam and Muslims have to be called out, which we don't do. And if we do only one side, then that's a problem. Either you're afraid or you have an agenda. I may be wrong on that, but I think that's not the right approach. Would you agree with me there?
Oh, I absolutely agree with you. That's the reason why I'm talking about Islamophobia and radicalization at the same time, and different forms of radicalization that happen. So I absolutely agree with you that one has to call out any kind of call to violence or call to radicalization within whichever segment of society it happens, because we're all affected by it. Right? We see how, for instance, Islamophobia, and I often argue with my students at Columbia, I say, look, we need to address Islamophobia not only because it affects Muslim community, it affects 1.8 billion Muslims around the world, and Muslims are demographically growing at a rate higher than any other religious community. Muslims are going to be the dominant demographic group in the world in a couple of decades. So, but it's not only to change the conditions for Muslims, but also because Islamophobia feeds white supremacy, and white supremacy is an issue that is affecting adversely, for instance, social cohesion in the United States. And so, anytime we can connect, I think, these different, and obviously radicalization in the name of Islam, that is a response often to Islamophobia, is a problem, ISIS, Boko Haram, and whatnot. So anytime we can connect and demonstrate parallels between these negative movements that radicalize in our societies is important, because we enable average person who doesn't know much about Islam or doesn't know much about radicalization to see how white supremacy is no different than extremism in the name of Islam. The parallels in behaviors and beliefs are very much similar, and both are destructive for our societies, and both need to be addressed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Amra. I think Irfan Bhai was trying to say something before I interrupted. You want to say something, Irfan Bhai, again?
No, I was thanking her for a very beautifully and balanced and right answer, and then really enriched by her talk and her presentation. And thank you, Faiz Bhai, for inviting us for this lecture. Believe me, it has opened so many doors on how to look forward towards this radicalization and how to answer Islamophobia practically. Alhamdulillah. Thank you for both of you for
I think we must thank Amra more, because she was kind enough to accept my invite and address us. And she's extremely busy because she's been attending too many interviews and also teaching assignments on whatnot. And yet she's here. It's been 2 hours now, and I don't know how. I mean, we can't hold her. Pardon me?
We can have her.
Sorry. Yeah. I mean, I will let you know that, certainly. Of course, I will do that. And before that, if anybody, because since we are short of time, if there is any other question by anybody else, can we make this one last question, if possible, Amra? Or because it's 9:30 in India, it must be 11 a.m. in New York. And
let's
I mean,
have
how long? Perhaps can we take another question if you have the time?
Yes, let's do one more question.
Yes. If somebody wants, somebody who has not asked the question before, because we want to give somebody else a chance. Anybody else who wants to ask, maybe they can unmute and ask. Well, I mean, I would expected some ladies to ask. We have a lady called Nasreen here. We have another lady called Shazia Sambreen. They never ask any questions. I think you need to be a little more active on the group, right? And if you have any questions, perhaps you should ask. See, the idea is to interact. Otherwise, you can always read scholars like Amra on the internet or the books, but then this is an opportunity to interact with them personally. And I think you should not miss this opportunity, in my opinion.
And Faiz, I would add to that. I've had conversations with a number of women over the last week or so who've asked questions, even just how it is to be a woman in this kind of position, having these conversations. So I always welcome, I just want to add to that, I welcome any questions. I am more than happy to answer whatever questions are on your mind. I always tell my students, there's no bad question. All questions are great questions. So
yes.
Go ahead.
Indeed. But for some reason, the women don't want to open up. Nasreen and Shazia Sambreen, are you there? Or maybe you perhaps you're left with your audio and video on, perhaps, or with audio on at least. No. Looks like either they're not hearing us or maybe they're not there. They may be connected, but they're not there, perhaps. So I think in that sense, in that case, we should end the talk, Amra, because we don't have any other questions, and I've had my share of questions, and of course many others have had their share of questions too. And you must also be tired because you've been speaking for more than 2 hours now. It must not be. It's not an easy task. Because even in a classroom, I think your lecture will be what, mostly for an hour at the most. I mean, I don't think you give 2-hour lectures in one shot.
No, it's 2 hours.
No.
It's slightly shorter than 2 hours. So.
Oh, sometimes 2 hours, is it?
Yes.
Okay. Anyway,
so
basically, I must thank you, Amra, once again. And I mean, I look forward to reading your because I have ordered the book, and because there was a Kindle version, but I thought I will buy a hard copy. So I've ordered it. It'll take some more time for it to appear. I mean, for it to come to me. And so I think I haven't read the book yet. So, but I look forward to reading your book, and also look forward to reading the articles that you mentioned in your talk, inshallah. And thank you so much. And as you could have seen, the participants were thoroughly impressed by the talk, and I'm sure this will have a big effect on the way they understand Islam and Islamophobia both, and also how to stop radicalization within the Muslim community. That's also a big task for us. We need to introspect, we need to reinterpret Islam, we need to reimagine Islam, we need to intellectually counter all this extremist narrative that is being propagated through the internet at the moment. That is a big task for Muslims too. So anyway, thank you so much. And I also thank all the participants who have been here. Thank you, everybody else. So thank you, Amra. You want to say something? And
I just want to really thank you for inviting me, connecting with me, and thank you for having these conversations, particularly in India. I think it's very very important. And I appreciate you supporting my book. And as I say to many other Muslims who reach out to me, perhaps the best gift to a friend who is not Muslim or someone that is in your community to understand where and how Islamophobia can emerge is to gift my book as a present. It's not the story as you repeated, and as I said, it's not the story that preaches, but it's a story that educates, and educates broadly. And I think it evokes a sense of understanding and empathy in people that they might not have had before. So thank you again for inviting me. Thank you everybody for asking wonderful questions. And you can always reach out to me, and I'm sure Faiz, you and I will continue to have conversation going forward. That this is just
certainly.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and have a great day, Amra.
Thank you. Bye-bye.